What is up, everybody, and welcome to the Athlete Blueprint Podcast. I am your host, Coach Hav, and today we're going to be doing something that is very different than anything that has been done on this podcast in the past. We are not doing an interview. We're not doing a description about anything ecological dynamics related, at least in the traditional sense, but we're going to be doing a movement deep dive. So this is something that I'm very excited about, and the topic today is going to be a movement deep dive into the movement behavior of one Canelo Alvarez. So I have been a boxing fan really all my life. Grew up watching boxing with my dad and my family. And so this weekend traditionally is a very big weekend because not only is Canelo Alvarez fighting, but it is Mexican Independence Day. And traditionally, that has been one of the biggest days in boxing, along with May 5th. So for those who aren't aware, Canelo Alvarez has a fight coming up with Triple G, Gennady Golovkin. Now, they have fought 2 times previously, with both being somewhat controversial. The first fight they fought, I believe Canelo Alvarez was coming up from junior middleweight, I believe. So 154, fighting at 160. Triple G, who at that time everybody was scared of, was kind of the boogeyman in the division, and they fought to a draw, which was pretty controversial. Many people, including myself, had it for a slight advantage for Triple G in that fight. Their second fight, which I believe was 4 years ago, I had it as a slight victory for Canelo. It was pretty split, but Canelo ended up getting the decision. So this is the third fight, highly anticipated, a lot of animus between the fighters. So I'm going to give you mostly my perspective on Canelo. He is the fighter that we're going to be talking about today. And then we'll touch a little bit on the end, maybe about my prediction, and then some things that are specific to this fight with Triple G. So that's Canelo Alvarez. For those of you guys who do not know, if you're able to see the screen, I'm going to try to upload this into YouTube. Hopefully I don't get any violations, but we shall see. So at least you've got the audio portion of this hopefully intact. So when we're looking at this fighter, Canelo Alvarez, we're going to be looking at his constraints and the constraints in this particular fight. And these constraints, right, within the fight and within himself are going to afford him or going to inform him of what he could possibly be doing and what this fight might look like. So whenever we're looking at anything, we want to look at the task constraints. So in this case, right, it's boxing, the sweet science. And I think there's some important distinctions in boxing that we have to make that may be different for people who are more used to MMA. Obviously, boxing is a little bit more of a constrained sport, right? They call Thai boxing. We tie the sport of 8 limbs, or the art of 8 limbs, right? We have the hands, 2 hands. We have the elbows we can utilize, the knees, and the feet. Well, in boxing, it's really just the hands that you can use. So it's a little bit more constrained than MMA, right? And this then really informs some of the outcomes that could potentially happen in a fight. Typically in boxing, at least from my perspective, the athlete that has the greater effectivities, that is the stronger, more powerful, hand speed, has greater hand speed, tends to be the fighter that wins. Whereas in MMA, some of this can be neutralized by some of the movement options available. For example, if a shorter fighter in MMA is fighting a taller fighter that uses range really well, they can go for a takedown, right? They can neutralize them with grappling by making it a more close quarters fight. Well, in boxing, that's a lot harder, right? You don't have that advantage. So you have to see fighters that do neutralize distance, a la Mike Tyson, go in there with a lot of head movement, body movement to try to get inside on their fighter. So that's something that I think is worth mentioning. I think another highlight with this particular fight is going to be, this is a trilogy. These fighters know each other very, very well. They have fought 24 rounds, very competitive rounds. And I think this is going to be important in the outcome today, or this weekend. When it comes to the perspective of Canelo, we have to think about who he is. So he is not the tallest fighter. He is 5'8". One of the, I would say, on the shorter end for 168 pounds, you have taller fighters in the division, such as David Benavidez, who I believe is 6'1". You recently saw Canelo fight Dimitri Bivol, who I believe was around the same height, and it was a challenge for him. He's usually giving up at least 2, 3, or 4 inches in his fights. Canelo had a different path to boxing than a lot of your traditional top fighters. He did not have an extensive amateur background. He pretty much learned on the fly, turning pro at 15 and fighting in Mexico, where it is easier to fight professionally than it is in the United States. And his fighting style has been informed by that. Canelo is not necessarily a point fighter, as some of the amateur or the fighters with the amateur background that you see, a la Dimitri Bivol. What I mean by that point fighting, that amateur style fighting, is a lot of get in, get out, keep distance, right? Because it is based off of points. The judges then give points to the fighters, where in professional boxing, it's who won the round, who landed the most damaging punches. So it's not necessarily just about, who landed the punches, but who does the most damage. And obviously knockouts over a 12-round fight, 10-round fight are going to be more prevalent than in the shorter duration of an amateur fight. Canelo is very strong. He's very explosive. He has a lot of power, right? That's very evident. Those are a lot of hooks to the body, and specifically, a lot of overhand rights. He is a strong fighter. He has great timing, and we would call this attunement, right? He is very calibrated or attuned to the offense and the movements of his opponent. He also has a granite chin, outside of Triple G, who probably, has the greatest chin in boxing. Canelo has an absolute killer chin. He has never been knocked down. The only time I believe he has been really stunned was against, I believe, Jose Cotto, which was Miguel Cotto's brother, earlier, or maybe it was, can't remember the name of his brother, but it was Miguel Cotto's brother. He was not necessarily knocked out, but he was stunned by I believe it was a right hand in that fight. But other than that, even against Triple G, who is known as one of the absolute most devastating punchers in the history of the middleweight division, Canelo has exhibited a very strong chin. And that, again, informs his decisions. He can get in, get closer, and is willing to take a punch if he needs to land his own. And I think something that's really interesting is the sociocultural and stylistic constraints that are within Canelo. Canelo is the preeminent Mexican fighter in boxing. Now, traditionally, boxers who are from Mexico or of Mexican descent tend to come forward and tend to be of the style of, I'm going to take your punch, but I'm going to then give you more, right? Think Julio Cesar Chavez. He is probably the most famous Mexican boxer. He was the one who would take damage, but then walk through fire and then give you those vicious left hooks to the body. Now, Canelo is not exactly in that mold. He is more in the mold of the Marco Antonio Barrera. He's more in the mold of the Eric Morales, the boxer puncher, Manuel Marquez, the boxer puncher who will come forward. And as his style has evolved over the years, he has come forward a little bit more, but he is naturally a counter puncher. And that is his style. And that's what makes Canelo and Triple G's matchup so interesting, because Triple G, his style is typically to come forward and throw bombs, work off his jab. And the last one, whenever you're fighting Canelo, I think this is important to know, he's the biggest name in boxing. Maybe outside of Floyd Mayweather, who's really just fighting exhibitions at this point, Canelo Alvarez is the biggest name in boxing. He has an entire country behind him. So when he fights Triple G this weekend, it is going to be a pro Canelo crowd. And whenever he fights, that is the case. He is what we would call in boxing the A side, meaning that he drives the financial windfall, the financial gain of this fight. He's the biggest name. So he, therefore, whether we like it or not, if it's a close decision, it's likely that, especially if it's in Vegas, that Canelo will get the benefit of the doubt. And that may be, what occurred in that first fight. I believe in that first fight, one of the judges, Adelaide Bird, basically had an insane advantage to Canelo, which, if you had Canelo tying or winning in that first fight, sure. But to have him up by 6 or 7 rounds was pretty ridiculous. So that's important to know. So I think when it comes to Canelo's strengths, I think, and really this can be said for most great fighters, it really comes down to brinksmanship. And essentially what that is having an understanding of distance, having an understanding of the ability to gauge your opponent's punches. And you can see, if you're able to watch this, in his fight with Callum Smith. I'm actually going to pause it to set the table here. I believe this fight with Canelo, he's fighting Callum Smith, who is a massive fighter. He is 6'3", and this was at super middleweight, so 168. Canelo, as you can see in the screen, you can see, if you can see this still shot, he's a whole head shorter than Callum Smith. But what he's able to do in this clip is really close the distance and just barely get out of the way of Callum Smith's punches. He actually jabs his way in, which is something that I'll touch on later. But as you can see, he's just out of the way of that right hand from Callum Smith. What he does, which is very interesting, we'll go back a little bit here, is he gives the perception that he's actually in range when he's actually not. So I'm going to pause it here as he goes forward. So if you can see this, and if you can't, I'll describe it. Canelo is in range based off of his foot, right? If you look at his lead foot, he is in range. He's well within striking range for Callum Smith, but his upper body is so mobile and flexible, and he perceives his right hand that he's able to get just out of the way of those punches. And that's something, and you see he dodged a left hand, you see over and over again. One of the criticisms of Canelo, particularly early is in his career, is that he's flat-footed. And he tends to be more of a flat-footed fighter. If you think of, fighter bouncing on their toes, a la Muhammad Ali, that will never be Canelo. He tends to be a little bit more flat-footed, which then affords him the ability to really sit on his punches, but it also affords him to have great upper body mobility. There's no current boxer, in my opinion, that has the ability to rotate, swivel their shoulders like Canelo. So he then relies on that rather than necessarily his feet to get him out of position. That then puts him in great position for counter shots, which is what we'll talk about next. So this, I'll play this. I think the actual part I want to stop at is a little bit later, but this is his fight against Billy Joe Saunders. This was for, I believe, a super middleweight title. So this is at 168. Billy Saunders is a very tricky southpaw with very good mobility. And so that vicious right uppercut, just brutal, that Canelo throws here, right? They come out of the clinch. Billy Joe kind of does what he's been doing the whole fight, throws that right hand. Canelo just barely, beautifully gets out of the way, has his weight shifted. Boom, right hand. And at that point from the fight, it's pretty much done. Canelo then begins to walk Billy Joe down. You can even see, if you look closely on the video, his right orbital bone is completely swollen and shut, and that eventually leads to a stoppage. So that just kind of gives you the idea of not only the power of Canelo, but just the incredible timing and understanding of distance. I do want to go ahead and give one more example. So this is earlier in Canelo's career. This is his fight against Miguel Cotto, and I believe this was at 154. This ends up being one of the more competitive fights. If you really enjoy skillful, competitive, really intelligent striking, then I think this is going to be a fight that you should watch if you can find it. This is with Miguel Cotto, who himself and in his own right is an incredible champion. But what you see, again, is classic examples of Canelo counterpunching. You'll see as Miguel Cotto throws that right hand, Canelo, right, again, this is based all off of his brinksmanship, is able to judge his distance and then come with a massive uppercut and stun Cotto. And they show that in slow-mo. He perceives that. He understands where he is. Again, his feet are a little bit ahead of his body. He has an incredible upper body movement. That transfer of weight back to his right side and lands that punch. So again, an incredible, right there, right? Beautiful example of Canelo being able to perceive distance and land that right hand. So one of the really unique things that Canelo does is and again, this is in the kind of the ode to other Mexican fighters. If you look at all these guys, Julio Cesar Chavez, they have an incredible left hand, particularly to the body. One of the reasons why that left hook, left hand to the body is so important is it because that's where that liver shot that shuts down fighters is. And so a lot of his fighting tactics, his fighting style will be to build off of that and then to set traps and then deceive his opponents, which we will get into a little bit later. So this is against the first fight against Triple G. And so it was subtle. You may not be able to see it. I'll go ahead and rewind it. But what he does is Canelo has landed. This is round 2. Canelo has landed up to this point, if you rewatch the fight, and this is what he's known for, that left hook to the body. And so what he does is he throws that left hook, and I have it paused right now on the screen if you're able to see it, that left hook with the angle as he's going, or as if he is going to the right side, that liver shot of Triple G. What Triple G does is it anticipates that, whether that's from an actual real-time online control. I'm not quite sure. I suspect it was more of an anticipatory shot from Canelo. But as he's doing that, he then throws that hook slash uppercut to the top of the head. So again, I do want to play that one more time because that was perfect, nice and short. We slow it down, sets it up. Triple G covers the body, and then that punch actually goes to the head. So you see that throughout Canelo's fights. Another thing that Canelo really does is trap setting. So he sets these traps, kind of like what he just exhibited with Triple G. He sets these traps, and you can see it with James Kirkland, which is an absolute brutal fight. So this was actually, to kind of set the stage, this was Canelo's first fight after Floyd Mayweather. And, to be fair, James Kirkland was absolutely tailor-made for Canelo. And James Kirkland was a fighter who I don't believe he's active anymore, but he slugger, minimal head movement, pretty easy to find, but he would come forward, which that plays right into Canelo's hands, in that he is that counter puncher, right? He is able to, like I mentioned many times, right? Very adept at moving and then returning fires to his opponents. Now, what he does here is he actually throws that left hook to the body, again, building off that left hook, but not with the intention to necessarily land it, right? But with the intention, and Canelo is very skilled with his intentionality, right? He goes and clearly has a plan with the intention of moving James Kirkland into his right hand. And that's what he does right there. See if I can rewind that. As you'll see here in a few seconds, Canelo Alvarez, again, he moves James Kirkland. You'll see here with that left hook to the body, right into the line of fire with that right hand, and eventually puts James Kirkland on the canvas. So Canelo is he's a step ahead, right? There's layered or nested affordances that Canelo is perceiving, right? He has that intentionality to not just think about his opponent in the moment. He's thinking about his opponent 1 or 2 steps ahead, which is really, again, one of the things that makes him a great fighter. And we're going to go ahead and show another clip from his fight with Kirkland. So this was, I believe, the final knockout blow. This is, an absolute slugfest of a fight. But one of the things that Canelo does is he doesn't just throw feints with his shoulders. He doesn't really do a lot of foot feints. But what he does do a lot of feints with is his eyes, right? And this is something that I think is fairly unique. I'll go back a little bit. So we'll show that again. In this clip, he And hopefully you guys saw that. But what he does is he's actually looking to the body, right? He's looking at the body of Kirkland, but then comes in with that overhand right. Really high level stuff. Again, with that deception, he's building off of his body attack. He looks, see if you can rewind it a little bit. Looks to the body of Kirkland right there, and then lands that overhand right. See that one more time. He set that up throughout the fight right there. Boom. Catches Kirkland, avoids the punch. Again, building off that left hook. So one of the more, I think, underrated elements of Canelo's game is his head movement. And it's very perceptive. I think sometimes when we classify head movement, there's boxers that are just constantly come in and moving their head, just kind of in predictable patterns, right? They're just kind of moving their head to move their head, which again is valuable, right? But Canelo is a little bit different. He doesn't necessarily move it a lot, but it's very perceptive. He's able to see what his opponents are doing and subtly either roll out of the way of those punches, duck, parry. He's got one of those active guards where he's able to parry punches. But here is his fight against Daniel Jacobs. And as we're watching this, right, he at least 2 punches there, right? Subtle head movement. Again, active guard. You see his right hand going down. Again, avoiding those punches. Again, we're going to watch that again. You see Canelo walking in. He's able to see and perceive, right? Subtle head movement there. Again, active guard with that right hand, parrying some punches. And that's, I think, is probably the most overlooked element of Canelo. A lot of people want to focus on the power, the left hook, some of the stuff that I discussed, but I think his head movement, it's very clear he's attuned to what his opponents are doing. So now that we talked about the strengths of Canelo, I do want to talk about the areas that give Canelo problems. So what gives Canelo problems? So fortunately, there's a typo there, but that's supposed to be Bivol, but strong jabs. So Dimitri Bivol was the last fight that Canelo had, I think 4 or 5 months ago. And Dimitri Bivol was the first one since Floyd Mayweather to give Canelo problems and to ultimately, to actually beat Canelo, right? And Dimitri Bivol is a taller fighter. Canelo, credit to him, moved up to 175, fighting above, a weight class above. And there's this phrase in boxing that says a good big man beats a great little man. And that's, again, I think goes to some of the natural constraints that the rules of boxing has, right? Canelo can't work his way in via, a single leg takedown, right? He's got to find his way in. And I think one of the issues that as he's evolved, Canelo's become more and more of a power puncher, more of a stalker, less of a boxer counterpuncher. And I think that hurt him in this fight. And he ended up eating a lot of jabs and being at the end of a lot of 1-2s, a lot of left jabs and right hands from Dimitri Bivol. Dimitri Bivol, he has that European amateur style of boxing, a very strong amateur background, keep you on the end of his punches and move out of the way. And those tend to be the boxers that give Canelo problems. Coincidentally, Triple G has a very strong jab. I believe I was hearing a stat that he has one of the more accurate jabs of all time via CompuBox, which is like fight metric for boxing, right? They measure these stats. And if you look at the second half of their last fight, that is when Triple G started to turn the tide. The second half of the last fight, which I should probably save a little bit of this, but the second half of the last fight is when Triple G really exhibited that strong left hand. So long story short, strong jabs can give Canelo problems. Slick boxers. So 2 of the more competitive fights, Floyd Mayweather, there were some other extenuating circumstances. Canelo was 23. He was weight drained. Floyd Mayweather, something that he did that was very smart and intelligent is he had that, I believe he had a rehydration clause which meant that Canelo was probably a little bit drained. But, Floyd is also one of the greatest boxers of all time. But slick boxers tend to give Canelo a problem. If you look at that fight, and if you look at the fight with Erislandy Lara, that fight, again, Erislandy was a Cuban amateur, if you're a boxing fan, kind of that Pernell Whitaker style left southpaw. He also gave Canelo problems. Some people think Canelo didn't win that fight. I thought he did. It was very close. Could have gone either way. Austin Trout gave Canelo a little bit of problems until he landed that right hand. But you get my point. Slick boxers have given Canelo problems. That being said, I put maybe behind that because lately Canelo has, done better, right? Billy Joe Saunders, slick boxer, knocked him out. Caleb Plant, slick boxer, knocked him out. So I do think he has largely rectified that problem. Boxers with length. And that's where Dimitri Bivol gave him some issues. He kept him at the end of that jab, naturally went against some of the tendencies that Canelo has, right? His ability to get in, neutralize some of those body shots. Not everybody can do that, right? Canelo still landed a whole lot of shots that Dimitri Bivol blocked with his guard. And most boxers, Callum Smith was one of them, they leave with welts and bruises and welts on their forearms and their biceps. But Dimitri Bivol was able to withstand that. And then again, that amateur boxing style that you see in a lot of European and Cuban boxers with that strong amateur style system, a lot of Russian boxers that are able to keep the fighters on the end of their punches. So now when it comes to respect of this fight with coming up this weekend, so Triple G, as I mentioned, this is the third installment of their fight. And already it is probably the best or the second best modern trilogy, within the last 20 years. I would say modern, I guess Pacquiao Marquez I believe was a 4-fight series. Outside of that fight, Pacquiao Marquez. Outside of that fight, I think it is the best, most competitive modern trilogy we have. Maybe the most famous is Gatti Ward, but those athletes weren't on the level of skill of Canelo and Triple G. As I mentioned earlier, the first fight was a close fight. Triple G probably won. If you go back and watch that fight, Canelo was playing the role more of counterpuncher, right? Triple G was walking him down, and Canelo was landing the cleaner for a while anyway, counter punching, clean shots. Right. In the second fight, that flipped, right? That script was flipped and Canelo came forward and he became the aggressor, which is why some people gave that fight to Canelo, because he was the aggressor. And in boxing, that tends to be rewarded. Again, a close fight, Canelo winning the first half of the fight, but then you notice something, and I think this has relevance here. In the second half of the last fight is that Triple G ended up using his jab and really bothering Canelo, right? So, when I was thinking about this fight and my prediction, and even my prediction for the Bivol fight, that was in the back of my mind. Now let's jump to the Bivol fight. Bivol really utilized that jab and gave Canelo a lot of problems. Now, a couple things here. Triple G is not Dimitri Bivol. He is coming up from 160. He's probably, relatively the same size, but he's not bigger than Canelo per se. I believe he is a little bit longer, but he does have an excellent jab. So can Triple G utilize that jab to neutralize Canelo a little bit? I think if he's smart, that's what he'll do. Now, what does Canelo do? Well, Canelo's a younger man. He is 32. Triple G is 40. If you look at Triple G's last couple of fights, against, I believe the fighter's last name was Murata. I can't remember his first name, but that fight, Triple G got touched quite a bit, right? It was a very competitive fight. Now, Canelo is a much better fighter than Murata. So if Canelo is able to land some of those body shots, which I think is where Canelo should focus much of his attention, if he's able to land some of those body shots against Triple G, I think it will behoove him and will likely give him an advantage. If Canelo can figure out how to kind of marry the style of this stalking Canelo, who has pretty good head movement, but who has trouble with jabs, given his short stature, his anthropometric features. If he can marry that with the Canelo, who was more of the boxer puncher, who did jab his way in a little bit, in his latter fights, he's pretty much disregarded the jab. If he can combine those two styles, then I think Canelo will win in convincing fashion. I do think that Triple G has the potential to give him problems, but there's no denying that Triple G at 40 is not the same Triple G at 36 or 35 for when the last time that they fought. So my prediction, as we wrap this up, I believe Canelo will win via unanimous decision. I think it is going to be an excellent fight. I think both men will have their moments. I think if Canelo is able to, as I mentioned earlier, marry the styles of, the two halves of his career, I think he'll have success. If he just goes head hunting, Triple G, again, he might have the strongest chin I've ever seen, maybe outside of watching some older George Foreman fights. I think that is a mistake. Older man, go to the body, work off that left hook, layer in some counter punching. I think Canelo will win the fight by unanimous decision. Does Triple G have a chance? Will it be competitive? Yes, to both of those. But I think ultimately, Canelo Alvarez by unanimous decision in this fight this weekend. Well, that is it for me. I hope you enjoyed this. This is my first attempt at this sort of movement deep dive. I've tried to provide my analysis from an ecological dynamics perspective. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you next time.